Hello and welcome to part 2 of our lecture. So without any further delay, let's move right into our first topic for part 2, Hildegard of Bingen and women in medieval culture. So we haven't had occasion yet to really discuss a little bit more about the society of medieval Europe and how it's stratified and how people relate to each other. And of particular interest is the role of women in the Middle Ages. Throughout most of Europe during this time period, women were seen by many in popular discourse to be inferior to men. That was a pretty common attitude that people had throughout the Middle Ages. The church in Rome taught women that they should be meek and obedient to their fathers and their husbands. That was a common part of religious discourse about women at the time. In reality, however, very few women could simply sit quietly at home. Most did, in fact, work for a living. They would have to be in the fields behind their husbands and fathers, while at the same time, of course, feeding and clothing their families. So while the church and popular opinion may say that a woman's place was in the home and raising the children and so on, the reality for most people was that you simply couldn't have the women of your family in the house all of the time. They were out in the fields, they were learning a trade, they were participating out of necessity. In fact, the wives and daughters of craftsmen were very frequently employed and operated as tradeswomen in their own right. However, very few became powerful enough to have any bearing on national events, and in many cases we don't have the names of these craftswomen recorded to us for a lot of different reasons. Now, I want to pay attention to the role of women within the church because we're focused primarily on the Catholic Church and Catholic art in Europe at this time. It's the Benedictine rule that will establish religious ordered life for both men and women. Women within the Benedictine rule were described in contradictions. It's hard to sort of get a finger on how women were to be treated or exactly what their role within the church was. On the one hand, the church and the Benedictine rule will establish that women were a constant threat to male chastity, that the mere fact that a woman was around could lead a man to impure thoughts. But at the same time, the church would also say that women were able to participate in the spiritual community, but they had to do so, they had to give up their sexuality, and that by taking vows of chastity and giving up their sexuality, keeping themselves covered, all of those sorts of things, that this is how women had to pay penance for the sins of Eve. Life in a convent was an alternative for women in the Middle Ages who did not marry, because one could not be married and a nun at this time. And it thus did provide a forum for women to express themselves and pursue education outside of familial patriarchal control. So it's kind of an interesting society if you think about it. Women would join a convent for a variety of different reasons. For whatever reason, a woman came of age, but there was no husband for her to marry. There was no way for her to get married, or she found she couldn't have children or something. She might join a convent for that. Women who became widows might join a convent. Very often, it was not uncommon for family to I don't know the delicate way to put this, but sort of give their daughters to the church, to a convent, at an early age. I mean, 7, 8, 9 years old. Families might give a daughter to the church as an act of penance or what have you. So that was not uncommon as well. Women would enter into a convent as children and just be raised in the convent. Once a woman was in the convent, she was very often going to learn how to read and write, which was not always something that women could have access to outside of that community. She was in a community of women who could express themselves and talk amongst each other, and so have a certain kind of community or sisterhood, at least, within the confines of the convent. And then could pursue education and pursue reading and writing and music. And that's going to bring us to the woman you see on the screen here, Hildegard von Bingen, who led a really remarkable life in a convent. So let me tell you a little bit about her. She was one of these people I mentioned. At age 8, her family, which she comes from a very aristocratic, a pretty wealthy family, but when she was 8, her family sent her to be educated by an anchoress named Jutta at a monastery near the Rheinhase. So we're up in German areas, up in the Holy Roman Empire here. Hildegard took the veil and made her nun's vows at the age of 15. So from age 8 to 15, she was being educated there. And this is an important aspect of convent life, even if you were a part of the convent at an early age, at age 8, you were basically there as a student. You were there as a pupil till you were old enough to make the decision to join. And it was believed, it was part of the theology, you had to want to join. You had to make that as a free choice to join. She did so. Hildegard did so at age 15. A convent was built next to the monastery, and Hildegard became the abbess. She then founded her own convent over at Bingen. Now here's where Hildegard is set apart from others. She confided at some point early in her career that she was having visions. She told her abbess, Jutta, that she was having miraculous visions and that she believed that God was speaking to her through those visions. She went to Jutta, and Jutta brought in a monk named Volmar, and Volmar was an illustrator. And so Volmar started illustrating the visions that Hildegard was having. The visions, according to Hildegard, clarified the meaning of major biblical and religious texts, and she would eventually compile these visions into what we now call the Scivias, a book that she published called the Scivias. In addition to that, she's not just a writer of these visionary works. She was also a musician. She wrote a great deal of religious music. She wrote a great deal about science, about biology, about nature. She was a very well-educated woman and contributed a lot to medieval scholarship. Excuse me. So she's famous for writing and composing medieval music at this time. She's also extremely, at the height of her career, the height of her life, she will be so well respected that she's actually consulted by and she advised bishops, popes, and kings. So her visions and her writings are so influential that kings will seek her out. The Pope will seek her out to get advice from her. Really remarkable, given, again, the status of women within medieval society. So let's take a look at some of her visions and how they're being illustrated. So I want to give you a sense in how remarkable the Scivias is as a text that Hildegard is bringing to us. So she reportedly has these visions where she'll see a blinding light and she'll feel faint and she'll have to lie down, and she'll see lights and visions and she'll feel nauseous. She sometimes reports feeling like any kind of light or noises are just agonizing to her. In many cases, these are symptoms that are associated today with migraine headaches, like really extreme cases of migraine headaches. But she's having these visions while she's in this state. And when she recovers from the vision, when she recovers from the state, she's writing down in great detail what she's experienced. And then she's using the vision to help clarify and interpret different passages from the Bible. And then either her or this monk Volmar are transcribing those written passages into visual images. And that's what we're looking at here. So on the left-hand side, that text, I'd encourage you to pause this and read them. These are passages from the Scivias, from her visions. And then on the right, you actually see a page from the book with the illustration itself. What's really remarkable about the Scivias is this is a completely unique iconography. You don't see representations of these in any church. You don't see them in any illuminated gospels. She's coming up with a completely unique iconography here. So in this piece, you see this radiant golden angel with these massive wings. You see people in this mountain. We're just not seeing these kinds of illustrations anywhere else. So we see here the Lord of the universe enthroned as an angel of great counsel on an iron-colored mountain, which represents the eternity of his kingdom. And so these are things that Hildegard are using to interpret the Bible through her miraculous visions. And again, these become so moving and popular and influential that she herself becomes quite a powerful political entity in Europe during this time. This is another remarkable illustration, and again I have the text here, where we see a crucifixion, and we see the crucifixion represented as the wedding of Christ and the church. This is especially important to women like Hildegard, because as a nun, as a person who has taken vows, as a nun within the Catholic Church, she's considered a bride of Christ. It's very much the idea that a woman gives up her worldly sexuality and her desire to have children or anything like that, and dedicates herself completely to the church. So we see her here using that metaphor, and we see Jesus on the cross. We see the blood of Christ spilling into this cup. We see this female personification. That is Ecclesia, and she is the personification of the church. We see the altar on the lower register, Ecclesia kneeling before the altar. Just all sorts of really wonderful imagery, very beautiful, brightly colored imagery, and again, just completely unique to Hildegard and her visions. Here's another image that I find very striking and fascinating. I'll read this passage, and I encourage you to look at the image as I do so. This is from the Scivias Book 2, Vision 2. She says, "Then I saw a bright light, and in this light the figure of a human, the color of a sapphire, which was all blazing with gentle glowing fire. And that bright light bathed the whole of the glowing fire, and the glowing fire bathed the bright light, and the bright light and the glowing fire poured over the whole human figure, so that the three were one, and one light in the power of potential." That's just such a great quote, and this is such a fascinating representation of that scene. So we see this metaphor of the light, the fire, and the human being being used as a metaphor for passion and for dedication and for religious fervor. We have this association of fire and passion, but it's the color of sapphire, so this bluish tone. All three were one in the power of potential, so probably a reference there to the Trinity as well, but locating the power of the Trinity within the individual. Again, these are just really remarkable theological ideas that Hildegard is coming up with and reflecting upon. The image itself is quite amazing. We have a figure in the center with their hands up, not unlike an orant or praying pose that we saw in the early Christian era. The figure itself is somewhat ambiguous in terms of gender. There's nothing here that really clearly indicates that this is a male or female figure, and we think that that is intentional here, that we're talking more distinctly about humanity and not necessarily man or woman. That's very unique at this time. And then the concentric circles radiating out from the figure, really quite remarkable in the meditative aspects of this image. That again, I know I keep saying this, and I hate to be so repetitive, just unique. There are no other books that are portraying this idea of power and religious passion in the way that Hildegard is. And you can begin to see why she's become such a powerful figure. Even though we might want to say that she's somewhat of the exception. Many women, most women in Europe, are not afforded the sort of fame and prestige that Hildegard was afforded. But this is the reason. This is the access point for Hildegard. These visions, these wonderful, miraculous visions that she's experiencing. Here's another image, again going back to the symbol of ecclesia and her representation, where we see here, I saw the image of a woman as large as a great city, with a wonderful crown on her head, and arms which a splendor hung like sleeves shining from heaven to earth. Her womb was pierced like a net with many openings, with a huge multitude of people running in and out. And I'll stop the quote there. But you see all of these really fantastical elements, this golden ecclesia with people running in and out of her. She's kneeling at the altar with Jesus. She's above these flames. She's being embraced by God. This is also very interesting in how Hildegard represents the church, ecclesia, as a woman, with the body of a woman. A little bit differently from how Catholic theology had done so previously. There had always been an association with the church, with the body of Mary, which is why so many Catholic churches are Notre Dame, Our Lady. They're dedicated to Mary as the earthly mother of Jesus, and so there's an association with equating the body of Mary with being the house, if you will, the birthplace of Christianity. Here, Ecclesia is Hildegard is doing something very similar, but making it more allegorical and a bit more abstract in the body of ecclesia, and very much equating the idea of ecclesia with the nuns and abbesses and so on that are part of her world, that she would know about. That by taking the vows to become a nun, she is enacting the part of ecclesia and dedicating herself to the church. Really remarkable imagery here. I also want to point out, in everything that we've looked at so far from Hildegard, you'll see a predominance of a triadic color scheme, which is a primary triadic. Yellow, blue, and red, the primary colors. And I just want to point that out because primary colors, if you know, they're called primary because they cannot be mixed from other colors. They require pure pigments on their own, which makes them more expensive than mixed pigments. So a blue, a red, and a yellow, those pigments are simply going to cost more, they're going to be more expensive to make, and so on, than secondary colors, your purples and greens and so on. So I just want to point that out because we're seeing that use of a really dynamic color scheme that is also a very precious color scheme in terms of sheer expense, and we're seeing that being brought into the construction and composition of these pieces. In addition to the Scivias, her Book of Visions, she also created the Book of Divine Works, which is illustrated with miniatures representing man and the universe. So what we're looking at here is called the Universal Man. It represents the divine love of the Son of God. And just take a moment to look at this bizarre image. We see the fires of love and judgment burning in the chest of Jesus, marking the exterior limits of the universe in which humanity, takes this place at the crowning glory of creation. Really remarkable. So you see Jesus' head at the very top, but then we see him as a man of fire, so we actually see like a red, fiery person, and the passion and love of Jesus is represented as the limits of the known universe and all of creation. Then at the very center, we see a human figure as the center and most important creation of God. Just so unique. And I absolutely love, at the very bottom left-hand corner, you see a little canopy, and that's Hildegard. That's Hildegard at her book there, looking up at the vision, receiving this vision from God, and writing it down in her book. A part of that active communication between God and her. It's such an imaginative piece. You just don't see this anywhere else. So, to get back to the theology, to Hildegard, Christ's humanity was to Christ's divinity as woman is to man. Mankind had been fallen in Eve, but restored through Ecclesia and Maria. So we get this association here with the fall and redemption of mankind through the Christian church. And she's playing this out with these bodily figures. And just a remarkable, remarkable piece. Alright, as you guys have probably picked up on, I'm quite a fan of Hildegard. Not just her artworks and these amazing visions and writings that she's done, her music is also amazing. If I can get YouTube to help me out here, I'll try to put a link on this slide to a performance of a musical piece that she wrote. Obviously a modern interpretation of it, so you can get a sense of her music as well. She will be incredibly influential to church music and hymnals in the medieval era. And her musical works are extremely evocative and really quite amazing. I'll try to put a link to that here. Now, as we look at this piece, we see Hildegard, again, in the role of a scribe. So she is writing down her visions. She is sitting in a place where she can write. We notice a male figure on the right. That is most likely Volmar or some other monk who is going to be doing the illustrations for the piece. So we see her communicating to him. And again, it's very unusual here that we would see a woman in the place of prominence here, giving instructions to a male figure. While that was probably what happened within her abbey, remember she was an abbess at the head of a convent, seeing depictions of this still pretty remarkable. Now, I do want to make a point about what we've been looking at and Hildegard's connection to Ecclesia and the role of women in the images that we've been seeing here. I do want to throw out a note of caution, though, to bring us back to reality. Hildegard was not in any way like any sort of modern use of the term feminist. She did not actually promote women's enfranchisement in the church, but she did speak very positively of women's spirituality. So she was arguing through her works against a common medieval idea that woman is to man as flesh is to spirit. That was a commonly used phrase in the church. Instead, she argued that women's roles as nuns, as the brides of Christ, was complementary to the priesthood. Hildegard saw women as symbols of humanity, where humanity was understood as physicality. So some people have tried to read Hildegard's images and the use of ecclesia and these symbols in a certain sort of pro-woman feminist sort of interpretation. And we need to be cautious about doing that. She was very much a product of her time, and although she was quite exceptional, and her images are really quite amazing, she was not in any way suggesting that women should be treated equally in the church or given equal responsibilities. She was not going that far with it. She did, however, speak very highly of women's spirituality. She obviously, as an abbess, wanted to encourage women to take a vocation within the church. But she saw that as being a complement to the priesthood and nuns being a complement to the monks. So we just need to keep keep that in mind as we look at these pieces, which are still nonetheless remarkable. All right, you guys are probably tired of hearing me go on and on about Hildegard von Bingen. I really love her works. All right, so let's move on to a different location and a different event, but nonetheless an incredibly important event in European history. All right, let's move over to the west and talk a little bit about the Norman invasion of England and the Bayeux Tapestry. So what's going on over in northern France? If we back up a little bit, we already discussed in previous chapters the spreading of Christian missionaries into pagan Europe, trying to convert local populations of pagan Europeans, including the Celts and the Angles and the Saxons and the Vikings and so on. The Vikings were pretty much completely converted to Christianity by the 10th century. A large number of Vikings will settle and create colonies basically in northern France, in a part of France known as Normandy. They become the Normans. So they're French-ish, kind of, but they're from Viking stock. They come from the north, from Viking stock. So fast forward a little while later, Duke William the Conqueror, as he becomes known, will lead an expedition across the English Channel to the English Isles in the year 1066, and there will be a huge battle between the Normans and the English, which will culminate in the Battle of Hastings. Eventually, the Normans will win this battle and will have the establishment of Norman kings, Norman rule in England. To commemorate this battle, we'll have the commissioning of something called the Bayeux Tapestry, which is about 230 feet long. So wrap your head around that. It's 230 feet long, which will depict all of these events leading up to the Norman conquest of England, concerning William, Duke of Normandy, Harold, Earl of Wessex, who will later become King of England, and culminates in the Battle of Hastings. The tapestry consists of 50 scenes with Latin tituli, which are captions embroidered on the linen with woolen yarn. It's most likely that this was commissioned by the Bishop Odo, William's half-brother, and was actually made in England in the 1070s. Another interesting little fact about it is, although it was made in the 1070s, it wasn't something that was prominently displayed and was kind of lost. People didn't know where it was for a very long time, until 1729, at which point scholars discovered it being displayed annually in the Bayeux Cathedral. So this was an object that was annually hung up in this cathedral, but people didn't really know what it was, didn't really know what it was about, until 1729, when scholars come in and sort of put the pieces together. It's now in its own museum. Let's take a look at this thing. So as I mentioned, the Bayeux Tapestry is 230 feet long. It's about an foot and 8 inches high. So it's just a long, narrow piece of cloth that you could think about it unrolling like a scroll. And like a scroll, it's a continuous narrative. So it starts at the beginning of these preparations, leading to war, William crossing the English Channel, eventually all the skirmishes that finally lead up to the Battle of Hastings in 1066. It's an epic narrative. So here's just one portion of it. The Battle of Hastings itself. So this is, as I mentioned, embroidered, which means it's by definition not a tapestry. We call it the Bayeux Tapestry, but it's actually not. It's embroidered. And so as we look at this, we'll notice this is just a fantastic scene. We see the Latin tituli, so little captions telling us where we are, who's involved. We see animals along the top register. Those are probably heraldic, so they're indicating different family lines. But then we see the battle scene itself. We see knights on horseback, horses that have been struck down and are falling over. And at the bottommost register, we see horses and men who are dead, who have already fallen in battle. This is an extremely important historical document that we have. There's really nothing else quite like it at the time. It was made not very long after the Battle of Hastings, so it's a very contemporary document to the battle itself, even though it's being commissioned by Bishop Odo, who is the half-brother of William. So we'll say it's maybe not necessarily a completely unbiased document. It's probably going to show the Normans as being the good guys, if you will. Regardless of all that, it's extremely important in that it's a primarily secular document documenting actual historical events. Even though it's being commissioned by this bishop, it's not a religious document. And Odo appears in the story. It's a secular document, a historical document. And it's really amazing and expressive in that regard. Let's take a look at another scene. So here's the scene of William and Harold in Normandy. So prior to the Battle of Hastings, we see them gathering in Normandy. We see them on their horses. We see, again, symbols along the top and bottom, the tituli. We see these odd sort of interlaced-looking trees on the left-hand side. Those will pop up every now and then in the narrative, and you could think of them as sort of an edit or scene change. When you see those trees pop up on one end or the other, that means we've moved on to a different location. We've moved on to a different scene in the story. Really beautifully done. We will notice that in the previous one and in this scene, the handling of the human figures seems to our 21st century eyes to be a little awkward, maybe even a little naive in their proportion and in their scale, but they're still very, very expressive. And it gets across the action very, very clearly. And I have a detail of the embroidering on one of these. Here's a close-up of some of the stitching, where you can see that the stitching work here, the embroidering work, is of quite good quality. It's a very tight, close stitch. Again, wonderful curvilinear lines. I love that horse. It almost looks like he's smiling. I kind of like that. Woolen yarn on the fabric is how this is being done. Commissioned by Bishop Odo, and Odo probably had a large hand in trying to lay out the storyline. But we think that much of the actual handwork, the actual stitching, was probably done by a guild of embroiderers who were probably mostly women. Women weren't always allowed into different trade guilds, but where women could find employment in a trade guild included much of the fabric arts, including embroidery. So much of the stitching, much of the actual handiwork on this were probably done by women. And they might have had a certain amount of leeway to interpret the events and lay them out how they wanted, even though Bishop Odo is probably laying out the major scenes and progression and so on. I'm going to put a link on this slide as well that can take you to a website. And I encourage you to do this. This website is dedicated to the Bayeux Tapestry and the Battle of Hastings. And you can click through, and if you wanted to, you could look at the entire tapestry scene by scene by scene. It's a fascinating piece of storytelling. And if you think about it like a movie, it has a beginning, a middle, and end. It has intrigue and violence and war. I mean, it's a great story. And if you wanted to, you could click through and look at the entire thing, how it tells the story in a way that's very similar to how movies today tell stories. So it's a really fascinating piece of storytelling. If you don't want to look at the entire thing, obviously you don't have to, but I would encourage you to go to the website. Just look at a few of the images and get a sense of the variety of form and the skill and the craftsmanship that goes into it. So we'll end this week's lecture on Romanesque art by taking a quick look at this. This is the interior of Durham Cathedral in England, begun about 1093. So this is typical of that Romanesque style of architecture that's being brought by the Normans into England. And so we will see the Norman influence reaching over across the English Channel bringing their culture, their language, and their architecture and their visual representation to England. And it will begin to change the landscape and the cultural landscape of England in that way. So the Battle of Hastings and the Norman invasion, an extremely important event in the history of medieval England, to be sure. As we look at this piece, you'll notice, again, many of the same Romanesque features that we saw in part 1 of this lecture. It's a big, wide open nave. There's a beautiful rose window all the way down at the end of that nave. We see ribbed arch and groin vaults up at the top. We see the distinction of the different levels. What sets Durham apart a little bit is we can see these columns with their chevron and different kinds of patterns here, making this a little bit unique and easy to recognize when you look at the image. But we're bringing this with the Norman invasion into England, and this will begin to establish some of those architectural techniques in England itself. So that will conclude our lecture for week 12, a look at the Romanesque. Next week, we'll be moving right along into the Gothic era, where we'll be taking a look at some of the important social-political events that will change the map of Europe there during that time period. And we'll be looking at more architecture, looking at more sculpture, and seeing how these Romanesque works that we've looked at this week will evolve into something quite different in the Gothic era. We'll see a lot more emphasis on decoration. We'll see a lot more emphasis on intricacy, and we'll see some strides forward in the area of architecture and architectural design as well. So with that in mind, thank you guys very much. If you have any problems, questions, or concerns, please feel free to email me. I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can with those emails. So until then, thank you guys very much, and I will talk at you next week.